that the perception is that if a group becomes so small due to killing and displacement, that you can also remove its political rights. Whereas somebody else who did the killing gets greater political rights. It seems to be the reverse.
Right.
Seems like you should lose your political rights through abuse and gain them through not having abused it yet.
Hi, friends, and welcome to the Assyrian podcast. This is episode number 33. One of the things I cherish about the Assyrian community is that there are so many hidden gems that the broader community isn't aware of. If you've studied Assyrians from an academic perspective or for research purposes, then you'll have come across today's guest. But if you haven't, then you've been missing out on this intellectual powerhouse. He's traveled, studied, and taught far and wide, but just to give you a quick snapshot, he graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School and was a visiting fellow at Oxford. He's published so many articles and books about the Assyrians, cyberlaw, intellectual property, antitrust, international and comparative law, and human rights. Hannibal Travis, a professor of law at Florida International University, joins us on the Assyrian podcast, where Hannibal shares his passion for justice and talks about one of his recent books, Genocide, Ethnonationalism, and the United Nations, exploring the causes of mass killings since 1945. I'm so excited for you to meet Hannibal and hear this interview. But first, please remember to subscribe and review the Assyrian podcast wherever you listen to it. And share these episodes with your friends and your family. Show us some love by spreading the word about the Assyrian podcast. www.assyrianpodcast.com will get you everywhere you want to go. We're on Spotify, iTunes, Google Store, and Stitcher. Now, a shout out to Tony Kalgarakos and the injury lawyers of Illinois and New York for sponsoring this episode. If you know anyone that has been in a serious accident, please reach out to Tony Kalgarakos. Tony has been recognized as a top 40 lawyer and a rising star by Super Lawyers publication and has obtained multiple multi-million-dollar awards. Tony can be reached at injuryrights.com or 847-982-9516. And now, here is Hannibal Travis.
So thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm from Illinois originally, Springfield, moved to the suburbs of Chicago, and went to college in St. Louis, Washington University in St. Louis, and law school at Harvard, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then I worked in law practice in New York and California for a while, and since 2005 I've been teaching at Florida International University College of Law in Miami, Florida, the public law school for Miami, where my duties don't really involve Assyrian or international issues for the past few years, but originally I taught international and comparative law along with intellectual property and related courses. So the international law class gave me some chance to pursue my interest in genocide studies, human rights studies, international precedents, international treaties, and so forth. So I taught that in 2007 and 2011. But since then, I've been mostly teaching in the more IP, entertainment, internet law side, and not so much in the international law side. But I continue to be interested in this international law and Assyrian studies domain.
Just to recap or to dive in a little bit deeper, right now you're teaching about internet security.
Intellectual property, internet law, entertainment law, antitrust law, and copyright law.
All right. So you're the person to contact if we're going to be signing a contract, having anything digital related to it.
One of the people.
So it seems like it's obviously something you have a passion for. I mean, you studied law at Harvard, which was not easy to do. What got you into that area?
So when I was in college, I took a number of courses on philosophy of justice, psychology of justice, human rights, constitutional rights, equal rights, all this kind of thing. Then when I was in law school, I worked on the Harvard Human Rights Journal. I took courses in human rights. I volunteered on human rights issues, and I was always interested in it, and always interested in global affairs, and having some kind of a voice in contemporary controversies. So when 2004, 5, 6 rolls around, I have this exposure to international law and human rights. I see the contemporary controversies and news about Assyrian refugee flight and displacement, and calls for indigenous rights, and calls for local autonomy, and calls for maybe partition of Iraq, or other remedies that would improve the situation. So I start looking into things like the Iraqi constitution, and from there I look into what was the situation that led to the creation of Iraq and Turkey, and the Ottoman Empire that fused both of them. What was the situation of human rights there, and the Assyrian genocide articles. A lot of them by that time have been posted to Zinda magazine or Autor.com or Assyrian International News Agency. All these old books had been scanned and posted, from Joseph Naim or Abraham Yohanan, or they call it Animas, but it might have been the Mar Shamoun. So there are all these books available that you can look into. And so I started looking at these books and write articles, basically.
And as you were looking into those books and looking at what were the findings, like what was happening inside of you that charged you to want to keep pursuing it and writing about what you had found?
I'd studied the United Nations and the European Union in undergraduate school, and the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and other UN institutions in law school. And it seemed like that the United Nations and the European Union claimed to have an authority to promote human rights in other countries, and to intervene judicially or with some kind of an order or statement requesting that a group be given its rights, or that an individual person be given some rights, or that a situation be criminalized, or the situation be remedied in some way. So I thought I would look at these precedents, particularly arising out of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and try to apply them to the situation of persecution and flight from Iraq, because the situation in Bosnia had been one of ethnic cleansing, refugee flight, posing a risk to other countries, the United Nations declaring the situation a threat to international peace and security, and establishing an international criminal tribunal to punish and prevent further violations of human rights and the laws of war and the law of genocide. And I thought that given that similar situation and similar allegations, the rules and precedents could be deployed to similar effect in the situation of Iraq or other countries in the region.
So you saw parallels and wanted to say, hey, if this is what's going on there, it should happen also here, and this is what worked and what didn't work.
Sure. So a lot of my works have been about genocide recognition in the first place. Before a punishment or a remedy, there's just this question of how do we legally characterize something? And sometimes how you legally characterize something is very important, because if a state does something that we legally declare that it has a right to do, there should be no change. Mm-hmm. They're just exercising their rights.
Doesn't that go back to like the Nuremberg trials, where they were under orders to do something, and so how guilty are they?
Right. So there were some critical points that changed the scope of international law. I mean, even in ancient times, there were notions of protecting diplomats and peace treaties and this kind of thing, but it didn't necessarily evolve into punishing the other side or the king for crimes until many hundreds of years later, and then after or even in the late stages of World War II, the Allied powers get together and say, well, we need to have a war crimes investigation over everything that's happened. There had been a similar investigation after World War I, which had primarily been successfully carried out as to violations of the rights of prisoners of war, which were not necessarily thought of as crimes before that date. They were thought of as like state-to-state agreements. Like, we'll protect your prisoners, you protect our prisoners. And we both won't kill each other's prisoners. So it'll be better for both of us. But there wasn't a court to say, if you abuse the other side's prisoners, you're going to be imprisoned. After World War I, there were tribunals in Leipzig and Istanbul by basically allies or persons supported by the allies or brought somehow to power or sustained in power by the allies, that said we can try things like abuse of British prisoners or massacres of the civilian population or plunders as some kind of crime, either under local law or under these treaties about prisoners and so forth. So then after World War II, a lot of that stuff, though, failed because the resources devoted were not that great. The preparation of the cases was somewhat lacking sometimes, and the political will was weak because the war wasn't really over, and there were things happening like the rise of Mustafa Kemal and the rise of the Bolsheviks and almost quasi-revolutions in the Allies. People were sick and tired of war. In 1945, all of the Allies were still quite vigorous and were not tired, and the enemy had been completely vanquished in Germany, and there was a notion that the war had been so large and such an avoidable repeat of a previous world war that they needed to spend more money and do a better job on the war crimes trial this time. So they had the Nuremberg trials, and they established these three types of crimes: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, and crimes against peace. Aggression, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Genocide being one of the crimes against humanity. So then that provides a much more doctrinally precise framework with which to analyze subsequent situations, which is the framework that I'm primarily dealing with.
So you're going by the book, and you're going in historical order, and you're saying after the Second World War, they got more stringent with how they're going to perform these trials. They got more clear on what they were doing. And you're saying, look, that's something we can use, and we can compare it to what has happened to Assyrian people and how we want to manage those situations as well.
Yes. However, there's a big caveat, which is that after 1946, they basically declared an end to these trials, like they had done enough, and they turned it over to nation states. And some nation states did more than others. Like Poland had verdicts about genocide against the Poles and the Jews in Poland. But Germany and Austria basically let everybody go after a few years. And then there was no permanent international criminal court to do this job anymore. So every subsequent war that happened, until Bosnia, with a couple of exceptions, was like Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Guatemala, no court, almost no law. There were laws that the army could tell itself what its laws are, but nobody really punished anybody else in an international fashion in the same way. Then with Bosnia, they said, the European Union, the United States say, well, the same thing is happening again on the European continent. This time is different. It's not like Vietnam, far away from Europe. It's like Europe again. We have to do something. So they had this Bosnian tribunal, and then there was the Rwandan tribunal for Rwanda a couple of years after that started. So then we have the law of the international criminal tribunals, the prelude to the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court rules really try to summarize the laws of these other two tribunals with some other best practices and so forth. But the problem is that also is based upon consent, sending your own cases as a state to the court, or the Security Council sending a case like Darfur, Sudan, which Sudan did not send itself to the court. So still, cases like Iraq and Syria fall through the cracks, and Turkey and Pakistan and many others. So yes, they did more at Nuremberg, but then there's this very large gap and lack of action.
Yet that's what everyone thinks of, and unfortunately it hasn't transferred throughout all the other situations that are just like that one.
Sure.
Is that accurate?
Pretty much.
Which is devastating.
Yeah, but there are a number of cases you can cite where something was done even before Bosnia at some kind of a national or diplomatic international level instead of an international criminal tribunal level. And then since Bosnia, there have been a large number of these things. Special Court for Sierra Leone, Special Tribunal for Lebanon, case of Darfur in the International Criminal Court, case of Libya in the International Criminal Court, Iraqi High Tribunal, proceedings in the UN to collect evidence about Syria, private lawsuits about war crimes, about Bosnia but in New York, about Sudan but in New York, about Indonesia or Papua New Guinea but in California. So there's a lot of stuff that I talk about, but it's less well known, and it's not a major event like Nuremberg.
But one way or another, the injustice comes back to light and is somehow dealt with.
Sure, yeah. Some people would say it's not coming back to life in the same way. There's a decline in the frequency and the severity of these things. Starting with, you could say, the Americas. The Americas and maybe the Monroe Doctrine. There's been very little state-to-state invasion and aggression in the Americas, for the past 100 years. And then since 1945 in Europe, there's been very little. And then, since 1991 in Eastern Europe, there was very little. And then in East Asia, it was stabilized. After, I guess, 1974, 1981, maybe. So there's a decrease in the frequency of international wars. And then with the decrease in international wars, you see a decrease in the state-to-state genocides that happen during war, like Germany and Poland and so forth. And so some people say there's been a decrease in the level of these crimes and their frequency, and that wars are becoming more humane. There's more precision weapons. There's more precise targeting. There's more avoidance of collateral damage. But there are other people who criticize that, and they say that this all could be just a blip until World War III and nuclear weapons are used, and then all their statistics will be just thrown in the trash because everything will be destroyed.
I don't know why I'm laughing, but that's just, let's hope that that's not a reality for us in any way, shape, or form.
Sure.
But Hannibal, it's apparent and obvious when talking to you that from an early age, justice seems to have been a theme for you. Can you tell us where that came from?
I think my father probably wanted to be a lawyer. He was tried to be very fair and equitable in the home and in his work life, his career. So that probably something to do with it. And always interested in reading and reading about politics or novels about leaders making legal type decisions or political decisions. So I think probably something to do with it. And then the other things I've already mentioned.
And you mentioned earlier that you teach about entertainment law. What does that mean?
So you could say it's another type of justice. It's the justice of creativity and the justice of communication. So the justice of creativity is, when person A creates a character or a book or a movie or software and person B imitates it, how much should B pay A? And I've spent almost 30 years looking at that question, maybe 25, of adequate compensation and control over creative contributions, which is part of property law. We call it intellectual property. And there's also the law of communication, which is the law of cultural exchange, the law of sending content across borders, the law of invading communications, privacy across borders, or the law of war with communications equipment, cyber war, or other kinds of,
That's been huge lately, right? Yeah. So some of this for you is coming full circle, and this probably the extent is way beyond anything you've ever seen before, we've seen before with with the elections in the United States and all of that, and then now with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. Have you been following all that pretty closely?
Not necessarily. The criminal violations of elections law is not necessarily my field, and some of the Cambridge Analytica material I've been following, but I'm not exactly clear like what British laws that violated and stuff like that. So I wouldn't say I'm the best person to talk about Cambridge Analytica, but in general, I do teach this law of express or implied consent to sharing of internet histories and contacts. And it's often claimed in class action lawsuits against Facebook or Google that whatever they did was not allowed by their terms of service, or that their terms of service are unreadable, or were not required to be read, or were not actually read, or were obscure, therefore they do not govern the person, and some statute governs them, and I teach those statutes. So in one sense, yes, but in another sense, to the extent that it gets into election law, it's not necessarily, there's another set of specialists who deal with that.
That's not necessarily your bread and butter.
All right.
And now I wanted to dive into your latest book. Tell us what it's about, and when is it going to be available, and where can we get it?
So the book that I came here to talk about came out last year from Routledge, or Taylor and Francis, and it's called The Assyrian Genocide, Cultural and Political Legacies. And a legacy is like a message or an emissary or ambassador from somebody else. So the legacies of the Assyrian genocide are the messages and the bequests to us from that time. So the first thing I do is I try to figure out who were the people of that time, and what was the situation they're facing. What was the context of the mass displacement and killing of Assyrians in Tur Abdin, Hakkari, Urmia, and it possibly could have gone to Mosul, but it didn't so much because there was a German diplomat who opposed spreading it to Mosul at that time. So I start with issues like that, like I explored in my chapter in the book, The Assyrian Heritage, Threads of Continuity and Influence, about how ancient Assyrian culture transitioned into Christian Assyrian culture, the conversion of populations from ancient polytheism or paganism to Christianity, and then the spread of these Christian dioceses and bishoprics, throughout Mesopotamia and Anatolia and Persia, and then the rise of conflict between the various empires, British Empire, Russian Empire, French Empire, Ottoman Empire, and how the dawn of World War I, this decision was reached. Officials came to the conclusion that they had been stabbed in the back too many times by people like Bulgarians, Armenians, Greeks, and others who they suspected, and in many cases were working with Russians or British or some coalition that included Russia. So there was a phrase that the little Russia would be killed, and then the big Russia, or alongside the big Russia. So Armenia and Assyria were like the little Russia.
Okay.
And so it kind of started in this Ottoman-Persian border zone that was going to be a flashpoint between Russia and the Ottomans. Northern Persia had already been a zone of contestation between the Ottomans and Persia before 1914. So these areas like Bashkala and Dizagavar were targeted. Then Murgavar, Turgavar, Dasht are mentioned. Then it goes to Urmia, Hakkari Mountains, Mardin, Tur Abdin, that whole area. Then there's discussions of Mosul. It's countermanded, and there is kind of a lull in which there are more reports of starvation and refugees than of actual killings. And then in 1918, there's another spate of killings with the collapse of the Russians and the flight of a large contingent from the Urmia region, half of which dies approximately. So I go through a lot of the documentary evidence from the Germans, from the Russians, from the English about that, from the Americans, from the Assyrians themselves. And I have chapters from other scholars. Anhit Khosrova talks about Russian and Georgian files. Eden Nabi talks about memoirs and other files from Urmia region. Stavros Stavridis talks about documents relating to Lady Surma de Beit Marshamun, the sister of the patriarch, and Hakkari. There are also a chapter by Seyit Chetinoglu about Tur-Abdin and the resistance.
So it's a bunch of different articles from different folks.
Bunch of chapters.
And
I wrote the introduction, the conclusion, and then there's the other people.
And it sounds like you guys are going in depth about in these different areas.
Right, and it spans even from the 19th century until the conclusion gets into the present day in 2015, and how an environment of a lack of human rights, decentering or displacement of Assyrians could have led to a condition of extreme vulnerability, where they don't have the compact defense forces that people were seeking in 1933 or in 1918 or in 1919 with the Paris Peace Conference, a chapter about Paris Peace Conference, and how they were seeking a compact area that would be defensible like other states and communities
in other words,
even reservations.
They were obliterated for all intents and purposes. I mean, even if you give people a certain amount of rights or whatever, it's sort of you're just protecting them until the inevitable happens.
I wouldn't say it's inevitable. I do say that there are scholars who say that the question of an Assyrian nation is basically moot or a passé question, and that the question almost isn't even worth asking anymore because it's irrelevant to the real questions of Turkey, which is a binational state, and Iraq, which is a trinational state, and Iran, which is a bi or trinational state, with Kurds, Turks, Kurds, Arabs, and Kurds, Persians, and maybe Arabs.
That these countries are made up of multiple nations,
not including the Assyrians, which are so small as to almost be irrelevant. They're called a dwindling population. It doesn't mean they don't exist, but it means that as a player on the world stage, as a point on the map, it's almost as if they disappeared. Even though, of course, the communities survive and make many important contributions wherever they are, and in diaspora they do various things, and in their traditional lands they do various things. But
do you think that's an injustice that they're being looked at this way?
Well, it's an injustice that it is this way. Number one, you could say it's a secondary injustice that the perception is that if a group becomes so small due to killing and displacement, that you can also remove its political rights, whereas somebody else who did the killing gets greater political rights. It seems to be the reverse.
Right.
It seems like you should lose your political rights through abuse and gain them through not having abused it yet. But instead it's the reverse, where I talk about in the book how at the Paris Peace Conference and thereafter, the argument was sometimes used that the population was too small to justify a political organization or legal international recognition. But the reason why the population was so small in part is because I say that there were so many killings and deaths due to deportation. And part of that goes to the numerical debate, is that a lot of scholars want to say, well, the number was originally so small that it never would have made a difference. And then, I have various sources that are British estimates and so forth that the number was originally quite substantial, and that today it would be very large, because for example 2.3 million Kurds in 1927 Turkey is today like 12 million Kurds in 2012 Turkey. So it increases to critical mass eventually.
To foster growth, whereas the Assyrian people got crushed and basically have been fleeing and never were able to flourish the way other nations would be now. Now, going to a different place with this, do you think that the injustices Assyrians have experienced will somehow be redeemed?
I write in the book about how there's a trend towards greater remembrance. In the state of New York, Thea Halo, the author of the book Not Even My Name, I think was active in persuading the governor, Pataki, and later the governor Patterson to recognize Assyrians and Greeks along with Armenians in a sort of annual type proclamation. Subsequently, there were efforts in the state of California. The European Parliament in 2006 said that the Assyrian and Greek experience was similar to that of the Armenian when they called it an Armenian genocide, and then said Assyrians and Greeks were similarly situated. Sweden had a law pass Parliament after that. Part of Australia, the Russian Parliament passed something. There's a couple of other examples. Not coming to mind, but so there is some recognition there. Does it do anything? I try to say in the concluding chapter that there is a way that further genocides or crimes are prevented by remembering a past genocide. Because, for example, the UN uses a past genocide as a warning sign to recognize an ongoing genocide. So they're like on high alert in cases like Bosnia or Rwanda, and they're like ready to point the finger.
But first they have to acknowledge that one actually happened.
Right. So the UN not having acknowledged the Assyrian one and having an ambiguous position about the Armenian one, they had a document in the 80s that was kind of a recognition, but it was not really from the highest level. And then Turkey said it was withdrawn, even though I'm not sure that was accurate. So there's some ambiguity even about are the Armenians.
So the outcry that's happened from Assyrians because of what ISIS has done, that, look, there's a modern day genocide happening right now. Would you say that's legitimate?
I would say, I do say so. For example, I point to in the book, in 2010, the Our Lady of Salvation Church massacre of 50-some Chaldeans, I think, Assyro-Chaldeans. In 1993, I point out, in Sarajevo, there was a mortar shell fell on a market and killed like 23 people. They call it the Markali massacre. And people started to say there's a genocide in Bosnia because of that, 23. And there were still like a million, more than a million, maybe more than 2 million Bosnian Muslims at that time living in Bosnia. So every year after that happened, in the wintertime, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution that said ethnic cleansing in Bosnia is a genocide. Even though most Bosnian Muslims were still alive, there was a very large Bosnian Muslim army in the field, and a variety of other reasons why you might question that. They still said it. Then, in 1999, in Kosovo, the Serbs allegedly killed 44 Kosovar Albanian Muslims in a place called Račak or Rasak. And the United States, Britain, NATO, and Turkey all called that a genocide and used it to bomb the Kosovo Serbs and Serbia. So under that, the 2010 event is also a genocide there. Then there's a variety of other examples I talk about where there was like a pattern of incidents. Like in Iraq, you have this pattern of church bombings, and then you have the enslavement of women, Christian women alongside Yazidi women, and then you have things like mass flight of 200,000 people from a province.
But they don't ever officially get recognized as a genocide.
Well, Secretary Kerry did include Christians, I believe was his word, with Yazidis in the 2016.
But it was such a broad term, didn't identify the Assyrian people or the Assyrian Chaldean people.
That may be true. I don't have the language in front of me. But it was interesting, the timing. If you compare the timing of Kosovo and the timing of Bosnia to the timing of the Kerry statement, they were talking about genocide the same year as the Markali mortar shell, the same month or the next month as the Ratzak shootings, but 6 years after the Baghdad church bombing, and almost like a year and a half after the 2014 August famous events in Sinjar and Nineveh Plain and all that kind of stuff that provoked President Obama to say there should be an intervention to prevent genocide and to save Erbil and all this kind of thing.
Well, if you're listening to this podcast and you're eating this stuff up, then you're going to have to click on the link to get Hannibal's book, because we're going to include the link in our show notes. And then if you ever want to reach out to Hannibal, we'll put his information in there too. And Hannibal, one of the things I like to do just in closing with anyone who's on the Assyrian podcast, I always like to end with, if there's something you could say to Assyrians everywhere, what would you say? And here's your chance.
I know that you're doing your best, and I think that you will succeed.
Love it, man. Short, sweet, to the point. Thank you so much for being on the Assyrian podcast. Check out the book. Tell us the title again.
The Assyrian Genocide, Cultural and Political Legacies.
Wow. And many chapters from so many different scholars, and you write the introduction and the conclusion, and we get to go deeper into things like the Paris Peace Treaty and how all this stuff influences and impacts us Assyrians.
Correct.
Thanks so much for your work, and thanks for being here. Until next time.